I'm David Specht. I have a consulting practice, Specht Consulting and Facilitation. I work with organizations and their leaders around stuff like culture, how to set a strong culture and develop it, and also leadership development around that. So how to create leaders that are capable of taking care of your company and that invisible piece of the company, the DNA, the things that makes your business what it is and what you're proud to walk into every day, is this thing called culture. And if you read much business literature, you'll see it out there, but it's really hard to define. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about that, how to think about culture, some aspects of tending to it, and some things you can do to tend to it. A great organization thinks about how to take care of business in three areas of its life. One is the one that we talk about most frequently, is it has to be viable and financially profitable, just so it can be around to do good work for a while. It also has to be doing good work in the world in order for folks to want to come to work there and be proud of it, and to have customers who want to do business with it over time. And also, it's really key for great organizations to be able to find and retain great people who want to work there over time. And it's this culture, kind of the invisible rules about how we do business, our company's way, the practices that define how we go about things, that often makes the difference between being a run-of-the-mill company and one that's great and sustains itself over time. So I want to talk to you just about some of the aspects of what attending to that culture might look like. In meeting a new organization and meeting a new business, one of the things I enjoy doing most is having an opportunity to walk around and invite people to tell stories about what makes this a great place to work. Or if I get to talk to customers, which is really fun too, ask them why they like being a customer of this company, what makes it a special place to do business. And folks will tell you what they care about. And usually what they care about has something to do with the way that they're treated, the way the attention the company gives to the detail and the kind of service, and the way the employees feel about coming to work every day, and how they're valued and respected. And often enough, I've had a lot of people say to me, this is really true, that you don't get to have an organization without a culture. Every organization has one. The question is it the culture that you want to have? And how do you make sure that you tend to the culture you want to have once you've figured out what that is? If you're watching this video, one of the things you might do is take a moment yourself, and if you're watching it with members of your team, have a conversation with one another to think about one or two stories that offer a window into what makes your business, your company special. Recall an instance that led you to feel particularly proud of the company, or some feedback you got from a customer that helped you to understand why they value it so much. And if we were in a room together, I'd want to hear that story. They're great stories, and they really are a window into the heartbeat of the company. And it's the front end of beginning to define this thing of culture, figure out what's most valuable about the company and why it matters to folks, both the folks who work there and the folks who bring their business there. Last week, I was spending time with some folks in a really neat architectural firm. These folks who created the firm 30 years ago. When they brought it into existence, they were all trained as architects. I think they had all gone to the same university together. But they were trying to figure out how to practice architecture in a way that felt like it made a positive difference around issues that they cared about. And what they cared most about was how to provide beautiful and good housing for people who couldn't afford it. So how to create great low-income housing. And so they said, well, let's see if we can create a niche for ourselves in being the folks who do great design of low-income housing here in the greater Boston area. They're called Narrowgate Architects, and they design housing for low-income folks, and they work in low-income communities. They've been doing it for 30 years, and they have a very strong reputation. And when you have a company for 30 years, at some point you begin to think about, oh, what happens when I step away from this company, and will it exist doing the same kind of work and with the same kind of care that we brought to doing that work all these years? And that led these three owners to wonder, do our employees get what's special about this company? And will they continue to be able to do it? So asking them that same question, their employees in this instance, tell me a story that represents what's special for the company about you. They told a couple of stories. One was the story of what led them to the company. This person was working for a very large architectural firm and really wanted to change a pace where this architect was going to get to be able to practice architecture in a way that made a difference, the kind of difference she was wanting to make in the world. And she saw this ad, which was different from all the other ads she was seeing in the architecture journals, that said, want to bring your design skills to work in ways that make a difference for low-income communities? Talk to us. And she said that was totally different from any of the other ads, and it told me there was something different about this company. I went and interviewed. I loved what they were up to, and I decided this is where I want to be. And then 3 years after I arrived, the economic downturn of about 8 years ago happened, and the way that we went through that, because if you remember that time, money simply evaporated for housing and construction, and it impacted everybody who was building housing and the folks who were designing them, including architecture firms like us. And I still remember when the owners brought us into the room and said, we want to talk about how we're going to get through this together. Our goal is to see whether we can hold on to as many of us as possible, keep our incomes coming as best we can, and figure out how to ride this out. And as the owners, we'll tell you up front that we're ready to reduce our own salaries to make that happen, but let's begin to puzzle it. And this person said, I realized I was in a really different kind of company and that I was all in at that moment. So, think of what the story is that captures that specialness of your company. And it's a great way to begin a conversation about what the heartbeat of the company is, of your organization, and why it matters. Question is, once you know what that culture is, how do you tend to it over time? So I want to talk just briefly about 4 aspects of tending to the organization's culture. And in your mind's eye, there's a little inventory that you could use to be having the same conversation, but I'm going to talk you through it. And in your mind's eye, be thinking about whether your company is doing these 4 things. I'm going to talk about 4 aspects of tending to a culture. Whether you're doing them really well, whether you think it's happening okay, or wow, I hadn't thought about this, and as far as I can tell, nothing's happening. And here are the 4 aspects. One is your culture clear and visible? Meaning, is it explicit? Do people know how to talk about it? And if not, the work that you want to be doing is beginning to have conversations that allow people to put words to it so you can write it down and begin to communicate it. The second aspect of tending to it is making sure that whatever culture you have, your company's way, your core values, are connected to the way that you do your work every day, integrated. So that second dimension has to do with the integration of your culture into the way you do business. Do your core values and mission have a seat at the table around important decisions? And do people talk about them in their daily business and meetings? A third aspect is whether the culture is something that you as an owner are the only one who knows anything about it and can talk about it, or is it more broadly owned so that your employees and maybe even your customers could say what's distinct and what matters most about your company, and also become champions of it. So ideally you want the culture to be broadly owned. This is especially important if you're if you're a company owner who knows that every once in a while you need to step back from operational involvement in the business, you want to know that things are still happening the way they should be when you're absent. And particularly if you're looking to transition the company to other ownership at some point, but you want it to continue to be the great company it's always been. That the culture is broadly owned as the key piece of sustaining what it does well. Finally, you want ways of carefully tending to the culture that you've taken care to articulate and to build ownership for. And there are little habits that you can create in an organization that allow that to happen. They don't take a lot of time, but for a small amount of time and a little amount of energy, they make a big difference. We can talk a little bit more about those. So you've done some work, and you've taken a snapshot of where your company is around its culture, and you've noticed some things that feel like they're going well, maybe other places where you need some attention. I want to just make sure that I leave you with 5 or 6 different ways you can actually tend to this over time. So here they are. It's a simple list. Some of them involve more work than others. But the easiest thing to do, and this is really kind of fun, and it's connected to the question I asked you earlier, tell me a story about what's special about your company, is for you to have that conversation with your employees or a customer. Approach them and ask them, what makes this company different? Why do you love doing business here? What do you most value about it? And have the conversation with your employee. And here's an interesting way to frame it with an employee. Say, if you think back about your decision to come to work here, why did you come? What led you to decide to work here? And why have you stayed? Why do you continue to want to come to work here? Ask them what's special about the company. A second thing you can do is, if you haven't, if the culture is not explicit, one way of making it explicit is to work to articulate the company's mission, your organization's mission, and your core values or guiding principles. Have the conversations with other folks that will allow you to figure out what those are and push those out into writing. And in my experience, that is a little bit of a daunting challenge. Folks seem to enjoy the conversations, but pushing them into words, it feels like the words don't adequately represent everything that you were speaking about when you were sharing the stories. But create a document that will allow you to have a reference point. In some ways, that document becomes your compass heading as an organization. It becomes the framework that helps you to think about what's important when you make important decisions, and it wants to guide the way that you serve your customers and the way that you tend to your gathered life as an employee community of folks who work at the organization. Once you've made it explicit, be sure that you check in around how things are going around that. Ask your employees every once in a while, how are we doing around these core values? It's really a good thing if the values are important to you and they shape the way that you serve your customers, to check in with your customers once in a while and say, how are we doing around these things? We've said that we aim to do this. Tell us how we're doing. Get some feedback, and you're going to get good information about what's going really well so that you can continue to support it, and you also get information where you get to make adjustments. And because it's true, I regularly tell folks that I'm both going to encourage you to make these core values in your mission statement explicit, and I'm going to tell you you'll regret it as soon as you do it. So that's a both and. As soon as you articulate what's important to you and what you stand for, you will immediately discover, and if you don't discover it yourself, other people will point it out to you, ways that you fall short of it. So despite that, I think it's a good idea to go out on a limb and say what you stand for and what you want to be about, and so that you can invite yourself to be checking in with that and kind of crewing your course based upon what you aspire to be. So, ask folks what's special, articulate it into mission and core values, and ask people how you're doing with it. Have the conversation regularly in staff meetings. about core values. That's the fourth thing you can do. And it doesn't need to be a long conversation. There's some organizations I know who just take 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning of a staff meeting and say, let's talk about the value of teamwork at this meeting. How we doing? I love a story or two about where you see it happening well. If you notice any gaps, let's talk about those too. That's all information, and you want to keep the core values in conversations. It's also important to make sure that the core values and mission statement, which are an expression of your culture, have a seat at the table around important decisions. The most important decisions organizations face often represent dilemmas that they're trying to resolve, and sometimes those dilemmas represent tensions between the legitimate values that a company holds. Invite that conversation to be explicit around the decision-making process. A couple of organizations that I get to work with tell stories about the way in which they have one employee who reliably kind of raises the question, well, let's check with our core values around this decision so that we can feel as good as we can about the outcome and see whether there are adjustments we can make so that we're going to feel good about it. And finally, this is a little bit different. Think about the possibility of hosting a different kind of conversation with your employees, one about their own personal core values. For most folks, this is not a conversation they anticipate having at work, but most warm to it very quickly. And this is an idea that came from conversation with Tom and Kate Chappell, who founded Tom's of Maine, where they said that we want our employees to be thinking about core values in their own life because we want them to be ready to think about them in our organization's life. They don't have to be the same values, but we want them to care about values, and we want them to be thinking about how their decisions are being informed by them. So have that conversation. So those are 6 things you can do. If you're anything like me, some of this kind of conversation fades very quickly, so I'd encourage you just to make a note to yourself about a goal you have around this. You might use that if you were assessing how your company was doing in the 4 aspects of tending to company culture and notice there was a gap. Your goal might be related to one of those things, and create a specific action step for yourself. If you want more information about how to be thinking about that or how to shape an action step, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Again, my name is David Specht. You can reach me through my website at dlspecht.com. There's an email address and phone contact number. Happy to have a conversation. I'm always excited to begin. I want to thank you for entering into it. I hope we'll have a chance to talk face-to-face because I want to hear your own story, and I look forward to hearing what you do with this whole conversation about culture in your organization. Thanks for coming.